everyone, and welcome to my channel on Norse culture, German and Scandinavian languages and traditions. This is Irina. I am a historian and a history teacher, originally from Romania and currently residing in Germany. And I am going to talk a little bit today about nationalism. So my country of origin celebrated a couple of days ago the National Day, and I've been thinking about this topic and about the fact that it is still relevant nowadays, a big topic of conversation, still relevant in identity politics, and can be used in very different ways to promote certain political agendas. However, I remembered something about the term mundane or banal nationalism, so not about the big hot topic nationalism related to political struggle or war. And I wanted to discuss or address a little bit this idea. So basically, Banal Nationalism is the title of a very influential book written in the mid-90s by author Michael Billig. And he talks about something he names ideological habits by which our nations are reproduced as nations, and thus they go kind of unnoticed. And he quotes as an example the national flag. National flags hanging outside public buildings, for example, which don't especially attract attention, and because they tend to go unnamed and unnoticed, it cannot be identified as a problem. But they still constitute, so flags still constitute an element in the daily reproduction of the idea of a state, of a particular state. So this thesis about banal nationalism is that nationalism is not merely a hot phenomenon, so it's not always only related to political struggle or armed insurrections or various ways in which political groups try to identify themselves through political action as distinct nations. There are also certain ideological habits that allow nations nowadays to reproduce themselves, and they go uncontested, at least compared to the big hot topics we usually think about when discussing nationalism. Mundane does not mean positive or benign, yeah? So the institutions that are reproduced through this type of nationalism often possess, for example, vast armaments. They have intelligence services. They are in some way or another related to state forces. So banal nationalism refers, according to the author, to the way in which everyday processes and objects, so things we see around us all the time, help reinforce forms of national identity. And the kind of examples the author names are, like I said before, flags outside of the public buildings. This is pretty much ubiquitous in some countries. So if you think about the United States, for example, it's maybe the first example that comes to mind. So wherever citizens can walk around a town, they can see multiple examples of flags. And nonetheless, although they seem to be harmless, the author considers them to reinforce the sense of national identity and to play a very strong part, as a matter of fact. Another example he quotes is sporting events. So in sporting events, what happens is that the teams often mirror the national flags, and sporting events are events that bring together national audiences. If you look at the way footballers are dressed, you are going to find motifs from the national tradition. Another example he quotes is the currency. So coins and notes, they often carry distinct national symbols. For example, the Queen's head on the £20 note in the United Kingdom. And last but not least, he also mentions national newspapers, which not only can carry nationally inflected titles, he mentions here USA Today, but also makes distinctions between, the news at home and foreign news. So what happens at home is part of the national narratives that helps reinforce the sense of national identity. So the author believes that these signs of banal nationalism are all around us all the time. And he also believes that in terms of how we understand contemporary politics, there has been what he terms as a double neglect. So what he means by this is the fact that we tend to notice only, that kind of hot nationalism I mentioned earlier. So with wars and violent attempts to secure forms of self-determination. And this leads in its turn to nationalism being seen as something emotionally driven, something extraordinary, political challenge, as he puts it. And then again, we also tend to associate nationalism with various forms of extremism. And on the other hand, we fail to notice, in contrast to this, the very banal, mundane, everyday processes by which nationhood is reproduced and maintained. Secondly, those of us who are not particularly labeled as nationalist, perhaps not in a self-conscious way at least, do not somehow forget our national identity. So this brings us to the level of everyday life. And in everyday life, this means symbols and rituals. So anything related to money, the press, how it is divided between home news and foreign news. So nationalism in this way becomes a daily form of life in a world of nation states. So national identity is kind of remembered in a mindless way. So basically, we don't think about it. So, for example, when our troops fight overseas, they are our people, our soldiers, our boys, even though there is absolutely no connection or, direct community relation to these people. And here we can also remember the famous concept developed by Benedict Anderson, the imagined community. This matters. This is important because if we only examine nationalism as being something, related to war and extraordinary, we will fail to analyze the rest of it, the other dimensions that are part of it. And the everyday manners in which nationalism is reproduced is actually the bedrock of this phenomenon, and it brings about the ideological nature of nation states. So this aspect he considers to be overlooked or at least under-investigated. So he says, for example, social scientists have probed the most intimate parts of the modern life. They calculated the number of fantasies the average adult American, in his case he mentions here, is likely to have per day. But there hasn't been a census of flags. No one asks how many stars and stripes the average American is likely to encounter in the course of the day, nor what is the effect of all this flagging. So in addition, he highlights the distinction between national symbols inducing patriotism as opposed to nationalism in conventional discourse. Loyalties, he says, reproduced in schools as well are constructed as being patriotic, so they don't constitute a problematic eruption of this irrational side of ours, unlike nationalism, which provokes fanaticism and fanatical sacrifice. Now, all of this matters, not least because of the cultural power, military power that advanced nations, and particularly Western nations. As Billig says, national identities are rooted within a powerful social structure which reproduces hegemonic relations of inequity. Moreover, nations collectively possess weaponry sufficient to destroy anyone around them, and when states talk of using their military power, we should be able to reflect on what that means for us. Now, there is a point of criticism that we can bring here to the thesis of this author. So, for example, the fact that it focuses a little bit too much on the top-down communication of nationalism. So I mean by this from government, from institutions to the people, via such elements like flags on public buildings or on money notes. And it tends to ignore the fact that people also have agency in the way they construct a sense of identity that may somehow make use of these symbols, or at least of some of these symbols, or contextualize them in a broader set of identities. So people, for example, can have regional, subnational, alternative national identities. So we can bring here as an example the national press in the United Kingdom, who often run separate editions in Scotland. So people construct themselves as nationalized or regionalized subjects. So construct themselves, bring their part in the way this identity is formed, or is being contested, or is being reappropriated. Of course, I can also bring an example from home. The German national flag, for example, is no longer something to be hoisted on every occasion or on every institution. This is also due to the very problematic historical context. And on the other hand, regional flags are still a very big thing here, so as a form of local identity. Then again, we do have the problem of contemporary globalization, which is changing the picture. Nationalism and globalization are in some way in co-evolution. So there are times when nationalism is stabilized and taken, for granted, but this is not an irreversible process. There can also be various triggers, such as disasters or wars or changing political alliances, that can lead, for example, to movements to break or withdraw from existing nation states. This has happened with the Kurdish people in Turkey, and also with local forms of nationalism in Wales or in Northern Ireland. And that is why some authors say that it is also necessary to investigate the question of what underlies periods of relative stability, and by implication we need to investigate what causes this stability, this national stability, to break down. Overall, I would say that Billig's thesis is very useful for us because it brings questions of national identity down to the everyday level in which we are interested. So not only on the top level of the hot topics. I'm interested in your opinion as well. So do you agree that these unconscious markers of identity, these symbols such as flags, are important to reproduce national identities? And what examples of this everyday life nationalism can you come up with from where you are? I would be very curious to see some of your answers. So thank you very much for listening to this short talk. If you liked it, please subscribe and check out my other videos as well. Other than that, all the best and have a great day.